Hey everyone, this is James from TDB here bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to go back to some Pu'erh basics, going to be talking about how to store Pu'erh a couple different ways here. So in my opinion, the first thing you really need to do is you do need to define your goals. What are you looking to do? How many cakes approximately are you looking to store? You don't need to plan this out to an exact T, but I do think depending on what you want to do, you are going to approach this problem very, very differently. There's a big difference from someone that just has a couple cakes that they want to drink through and how they're going to store those couple cakes versus someone that intends to age the tea for 20, 30 years and intends to have quite a big stash, such as myself. So in my opinion, you usually should at least kind of by default gravitate towards the simplest solution. I wouldn't recommend something super elaborate for someone that's just looking to maintain the cakes unless the part of the appeal is in kind of like creating that system or whatnot. So I think very carefully about what your goals are. Is your goal to simply maintain the tea and make sure it's nice and juicy and tastes good? Is your goal to transform the tea slowly? Or is your goal to transform the tea very quickly? And kind of what time frame are we looking at? Everyone's setup is also going to be different, impacted by life circumstances, etc., etc. There are a couple universal things that I think most people would prefer that are kind of generally true for all of these setups. First of all, you don't want sunlight. You want to avoid fragrances. This one sounds really simple, but I've found that it is a little more tricky than you would think. If you think about it, a lot of people's homes will have like a certain scent or aroma to it, and especially if you're storing your Pu'erh naturally, it's very difficult for it not to pick up this sort of thing. So I've found in trying some collector's teas that have bought them kind of in the mid-2000s or whatever, a lot of them have a certain scent to it. It's not necessarily terrible, but it definitely has impacted the tea, and it definitely carries over into those teas. So a couple of them are still hanging out in my big Euro cave, and so I'm not sure how they are currently now, but they definitely have came to me and had like a certain very particular scent to them. And another thing too is kind of like by tea type, you want to kind of, if you can, store them a little bit separate. So for instance, if you have like a Hong Kong traditional tea that's kind of dank, you probably don't want to store that right on top of like a fresh farmer leaf cake. That being said, you could probably store them in the same bin depending on how big it is and kind of the density of things. But definitely something to be aware of. That's sort of related to the fragrance part of it as well. And generally speaking, I think people do not want to get mold unless you really are very dedicated in recreating Hong Kong traditional storage, which I have yet to hear of anyone that's really that really wants to do that. So mold is caused by a couple of things. It's usually caused by too high of parameters. So let my humidity get too high. In general, I think aiming for a humidity that's kind of in the mid-60s, maybe even the high 60s, is generally seen as safe. Once you start getting into the 70s range, it could be workable, but you start to get a little bit too much in the danger zone there. So usually what I use for humidity is just good old Boveda packs. You can buy those on Amazon. You can buy those a bunch of different places. Those are easy to find too. So I use the 72 Boveda packs, even though my storage just about never gets into the 70s. I find they work just fine. The goal usually is to juice up the humidity rather than kind of absorb it, at least in my Seattle climate. But in my opinion, too much has been focused on just that humidity number because like whether you use 72 or 68, I don't think that's usually going to be the cause of the mold if you get it. It's going to be caused more likely by bigger temperature swings. And I've seen quite a few cases of mold and people's stashes going bad created by just kind of temperature swings, which are not necessarily in like the hottest, most humid times, but could occur certainly in kind of a European or North American winter, especially if you have your tea close to the window. Think about condensation. Think about how we get mold in different places. I'm in Seattle. It's definitely possible to get mold just kind of naturally on windows and whatnot. And so that same dynamic can occur here too, especially if you think of tea kind of like a sponge, and it really absorbs a lot of humidity. And so you want it to have that humidity, but you don't want it to have too much. So swinging up and down can definitely cause some problems there too. So why bother with storage? This is all getting very complicated very quickly. Well, first of all, it's mostly so the tea doesn't dry out. If you've had some naturally stored tea from the West, I'll say most of the naturally stored tea that has not been humidified has been extremely unimpressive that I've had, if we're talking about naturally stored in the West. Different thing if we're talking about naturally stored in Taiwan or Hong Kong. Maybe Florida tea is fine. I've never had Florida tea, so I don't totally know. So people that talk about storage not mattering, or it doesn't really matter what you do, as most storages are different, but they're all going to be okay in the end. I think that's a blissfully ignorant view to take. I don't think it's correct at all. I think storage, anyone that investigates this somewhat, even in the slightest bit, not even super thoroughly, will tell you that storage absolutely does impact how the tea is going to transform and to age. So it's something that does matter, but it also matters for the maintenance of the tea and making sure that tea doesn't get too dry and lose out a lot of those fragrance and aromas. The good thing is a lot of that stuff is reversible. So let's get into that now. Okay, so how do you tell if your cake is too wet or too dry? Well, you can run into a couple different suggestions that you'll see on the internet. One way is to actually touch and feel the tea, whether it feels wet or dry. I think that's okay. I personally don't like that method, mostly because I prefer it to be kind of like cold and hard and concrete. So for me at least, I like to put my cakes in like a Mylar bag, such as this, and then just grab a hygrometer like this, dump it in the bag with the cake, let it hang out for like a day or two, and see what the humidity that the cake generates. If it's generating something in like the high 50s or 60s, it's probably generally pretty healthy. But you'll often find that cakes, after they've been sent overseas or something like that, will have dried out, or maybe the tea vendor's storage is on the dry side. Interestingly, you'd think that the danker tea, the wetter it is. That's not always the case. Hong Kong traditional storage involves having the tea in pretty intense storage conditions for a relatively short amount of time, sometimes a year or two, and then it's stored in a much drier area. So I've actually found that a number of teas that have undergone Hong Kong traditional storage have come to me, and they've actually been on the drier side of things. And so I found that they improve when you actually introduce a little bit of humidification to the tea. So yeah, in my opinion, that's a simple, easy way that relies on just cold, hard data that you can use to judge if the tea is too wet or too dry. Especially once your tea starts to kind of fall into like those 40s or 30s range of generating relative humidity, it's going to taste a lot worse than it did if it was at like 60 generated relative humidity. I've done those tests. You can check out those videos in the past. But this is the reason why you would want to maintain your tea. So how do you maintain your tea? Well, the easiest way is to store it perhaps in the packaging it came or in a Mylar bag. That's going to help to kind of seal in that humidity that it does have internally. Again, we can think of tea a bit like a sponge in that sense, where you want it to keep a certain amount of relative humidity, but not too much. How do we solve it if it gets too low? Well, I think the easiest way is to just take a Boveda, toss it in with this guy, and let that hang out. Depending on how dry the tea is, it can be rehabilitated in, fairly quickly, in like a month, or maybe it will take longer if the tea has been stored naturally in a fairly dry climate for a while. Let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, that's the simplest way to kind of have maintenance. We would expect perhaps the tea to slowly transform in that way, but usually if you're going to transform it, it's just going to take a fair amount of time. As people start to scale their storage, I think that's where it starts to think a bit more about, a mini fridge like I use, coolers, bins, that sort of thing. And my advice here is generally keep it simple. A lot of people are really into the idea of a really aesthetic approach. I think you can totally do that. I do think it adds complications because, like, a lot of the woods, the nice woods and stuff, those can definitely impart a certain fragrance. And so when people have been like looking for kind of these solutions or like really nice clay jars, well, if you have a really nice clay jar, then you're also exposed to just the natural humidity of the place. And so, for instance, if I just put some big old clay jars, dumped a couple tongs of Pu'erh there, and I didn't touch it at all, didn't put Bovedas or anything like that, it would get dry. That's just the fact of the matter. I'm in Seattle, which is known as a fairly humid place, but the storage here is, in the scheme of Pu'erh, is dry. So if you do want those aesthetic, those nice looking things, that's totally fine, but you will need to consider just a couple more parameters with that, specifically with fragrances and how am I going to put humidity into this. The advantage of something kind of ugly but functional, like a fridge, is it has a nice seal and it's designed to just kind of keep everything together. So mostly once you move up to sort of this level, this Pu'erh level, you want a kind of like a high density of tea within there. And so the goal is kind of just a slow transformation where we have the advantage of giving the tea a lot of time. And that's kind of my goals, more or less, is just to pack a lot of tea in there, humidify it, make sure it's at kind of a healthy level in the 60s, and just let it slowly go. What you will find is that depending on your climate, this is going to be rather slow. I found that for my storage, which at this point is something like 11 years, it's slow. It's not fast. It's not transforming this tea very quickly. And so, the tea has aged, but it's not winning any races, put it that way. So if your goal is quicker transformation, it's a little bit beyond the scope here, and it's a little bit beyond my personal experience, but I would recommend Marco's blog there, who is kind of one of the pioneers as far as heated storage. I think for me at least, these types of storage are harder to scale because I have a couple hundred tea cakes. It's just a little bit harder to heat that up. I think once you reach a certain level of tea cakes, it might get actually easier just because you might have to have just like a dedicated room to the storage. But for me at least, it's kind of a bit of a challenge. Okay, so I think that wraps up this video of how to store Pu'erh. So talked about a couple different ways. You have kind of the Mylar method. Also, nothing, by the way, wrong with storing a couple cakes. Just dump a couple cakes in here with the Mylar if you just want to save space. I'd say that's the easiest, not particularly aesthetically pleasing, but completely functional. I think if the goal is to maintain the tea or slowly transform it, that's a pretty good way to go, especially if your stash is not too big. And then once you reach a certain amount, kind of more the Pu'erh solution might make sense. And depending on how fast you want to transform the tea, if you really want to experience that tea transformed, then heating is perhaps the final frontier there. Okay, so that just about wraps up this episode. One last thing I wanted to cover, actually. Airflow. Airflow, in my opinion, can get quite overrated. I do think there might be a level where you do want a little bit of airflow. You don't want to totally suffocate the tea or whatnot. That, to me, is still not totally proven. That's not an answered question in my head. But I think if you think about how tea is actually stored in China, you have a cake, it's wrapped in paper, sometimes 2 pieces of paper, then it's in a tong of 7 more cakes, which is all wrapped, and then it's stored in a jian, which is a box, which is usually like 6 tongs or something like that. So these teas are not getting constant airflow like that. They're not taking out and unwrapping every cake and being like, oh yeah, get some nice fresh air or anything like that. These teas are not getting, so airflow in that sense I don't think is totally necessary. That being said, can the tea survive just totally vacuum sealed? I'm not sure about that. So yeah, that's the last thing I did want to cover because I do think that's something that does get mentioned quite a bit. I've done some videos on that. I think I did a video called Airflow is Overrated before. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you like this video, and I will see y'all next time. Cheers.